Hello everyone. Today we're continuing with the amazing story of Atlantis. And I wanted to go for a few minutes just to go over some of the topics and propositions that we went yesterday, which was merely an introduction to the course. So the purpose of the course, of course, is to demonstrate the several distinct and novel propositions. The main proposition is the Atlantis existed, and Plato's history and story is not a fable, but veritable history. That Atlantis was a region where man first rose from barbarism to civilization. That Atlantis became a mighty nation globally, and we will see that when we talk about different tribes all over the world that came from this nation. The relationship to gods and goddesses and locations globally. We'll talk about that culturally, and when we talk about faith, and that Egypt was the oldest colony formed by the Atlanteans. We're gonna explore some of the culture of Egypt. And where does Atlantis come from? We're gonna find out that Atlantis was the original seat of the Aryan or Indo-European family that we have today. Of course, we all know that Atlantis perished in a terrible convulsion of nature, and so we're going to explain what happened after Atlantis perished. Now, in addition to that, today we're going to start again covering Plato's history of Atlantis. Now, of course, everybody has heard about Plato, and Plato has preserved for us the history of Atlantis. If our views are correct, it is one of the most valuable records which have come down to us from antiquity. Plato lived 400 years before the birth of Christ. His ancestor, Solon, was the great lawgiver of Athens 6 years before the Christian era. And I'm telling you this so you have a little bit of idea of when did this happen, the timeline. Solon visited Egypt. A lot of the great thinkers and some of the masters, such as Jesus Christ, also visit Egypt to get knowledge from the Egyptian culture. Now, Plutarch, which was a poet of the era, says that Solon attempted in verse a large description, or rather fabulous account of the Atlantic island, which he had learned from the wise men of Sais, and which particularly concerned the Athenians. But by reason of his age, Solon was extremely old at that time, and so no one to, he knew that he was going to take quite a bit of time to complete the history of Atlantis. So because of his age, he was almost like in the 90s. He decided not to. But however, the story was passed down through his family. Solon was apprehensive of the work because he thought it would be too much for him, and therefore he did not go through with it. And we find actually in the verses and in the story of the Plato that got down to Plato, some words from Solon that says, "I grow in learning as I grow in age." And again he mentions, "Wine, wit, and beauty still their charms bestow, light all the shades of life, and cheer us as we go." I say he was extremely old to undertake such a big task of writing the history of Atlantis. Plato, ambitious to cultivate and adorn the subject of the Atlantic island as a delightful spot in some fair field unoccupied, to which also he had some claim by reason of his being related to Solon, laid out a magnificent course and enclosures, and erected a grand entrance to it such as no other story, fable, or poem ever had. But as he began, he ended his life before his work. So we find also that Plato's story is, it almost goes almost to the end of the story of Atlantis, but there's a part that is not completed. There cannot be questioned that Solon visited Egypt. The causes of his departure from Athens for a period of 10 years are fully explained by Plutarch he tells that he conversed upon the points of philosophy and history with the most learned of the Egyptian priest. Solon was a man of extraordinary force and penetration of mind, as his laws and his sayings, which had been preserved to us, testify. There is no improbability in the statement that he comments in a history and a description of Atlantis just because of his background as a poet, which he left unfinished to his death. And it requires no great stretch of the imagination to believe that this manuscript reached the hands of his successor and descendant Plato, a scholar, a thinker, and a historian like himself, and like himself, one of the profoundest minds of the ancient world, which we obviously have some writings that have stand to the history or the passage of time. The Egyptian priest had said to Solon, "You have no antiquity of history and no history of antiquity." And Solon doubtless realized fully the vast importance of the record that carried the human history back, not only for thousands of years before the era of the Greek civilization, but many thousands of years before even the establishment of the Kingdom of Egypt. And this is what I was telling you before, that they both understood that this was not just a history of just one group of people, civilization, but that it carried thousands of years of history that had never been per se recorded, but they had been passed down through generations, through families. So he was anxious to preserve for his half-civilization countrymen this record of the past. So we know of no better way to commence this course about Atlantis than giving you in full a record of the words spoken by Plato. So what I'm going to say next will be the writings of Plato as far as the history of what we know history. And in this conversation, Plato has recorded a conversation between Socrates and Critias. Critias was the godson of somebody related to Solon. And so that's how the story of Atlantis was passed down. And then, of course, Plato is the one that got the history. So Critias says, "Listen, Socrates, to a strange tale, which is certainly true, as Solon, who was the wisest of the 7 sages, declared. Solon was a relative and great friend of my great-grandfather Dropidas, as he himself says in several of his poems. And Dropidas told Critias, my grandfather, who remembered and told us that we were of all great and marvelous actions of the Athenians, which had passed into oblivion through time and the destruction of the human race, and one in particular which was the greatest of them all, the recital of which it will be suitable testimony of our gratitude to you." And then Socrates says, "Very good. And what is this ancient famous action of which Critias spoke, which is not a legend, no mere legend, but as veritable action of the Athenian state which Solon recounted?" So as you can see, they made sure that they explain fully, this is not a fable, this is true history that has been passed down through my family about the Athenian, recount of civilization, part of the Athenian civilization. So Critias says, "I will tell you an old world story which I heard from an aged man, for Critias was, as he said, at that time nearly 90 years of age, and I was about 10 years of age when I heard this story. Now the day was the day of the Apaturia, which is called the registration of the youth, at which, according to custom, our parents gave prizes for recitations, and the poems of several poets were recited by us boys, and many of us sang the poems of Solon, which were new at the time. One of our tribe, either because this was his real opinion or because he thought that he would please Critias, said that in his judgment Solon was not only the wisest of men, but also the noblest of poets. The old man, I well remember, brightened up at this, and he said, smiling, "Yes, Aminander, if Solon had only, like the other poets made poetry the business of his life, and had completed the tale which he brought with him from Egypt, and had not been compelled for reason of these factions and troubles which he found stirring in this country when he came home, to attend to other matters, in my opinion, he would have been as famous as Homer or Hesiod or any other poet." So obviously this person, Aminander, he knows that he has had a tale that he hasn't been able, a story that he brought from Egypt. So several people knew, and they knew that it was extremely important, but because of his age and whatever troubles, like he said, he had encountered coming to his country, he could not deliver this. So then he says, "And what was that poet about Critias?" said the person who addressed him. "About the greatest action which the Athenians ever did, and which ought to have been most famous, but which, through the loss of time and the destruction of the actors, has not come down to us." So as we can see here, they describe obviously because there was such a destruction that not a lot of people survived for this event, and because of time passing, so much time passing. Of course, the few people that escaped from the destruction of Atlantis, it's been difficult for them to pass down this information. "Tell us," said the other, "the whole story, and how from Solon heard this veritable tradition." And so now he starts telling the story of, Atlantis, which I'm going to tell you and start telling you in the next lecture. Now, I want to make sure that you know right now, the first two lectures, we're going to just explain the story in itself. And after that, we're going to be covering all the aspects of Atlantis. So bear with me as we go through this part of history, which is the Plato's history or recollection of facts.